So Harold, as I was saying off camera, like honestly, such an honor to be in conversation with someone so esteemed as yourself. Like like I'd say one of the godfathers, nearly a true crime, and I don't think I'm being hyperbolic with that statement, but all the books, like man, you have really gone into the realms of like serial killers, true crime, and like did it before a lot of people were doing it. So
Yeah.
maybe to hit you straight off the bat with a question, like where did even true crime originate from? Like where did like not only the fascination, but like maybe where did the literature even come from?
hmm Well, it goes really back to the invention of the printing press. I remember when Wikipedia first got started, their true crime entry said that it began with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, which amused me because I was off by about 3 centuries or so. Um, people have always been very fascinated by gory and gruesome crimes. In the past, really before sort of mass literacy and before the invention of the printing press, whenever a crime would happen, it would be turned into a kind of ballad, we now call murder ballads, which were then, once Gutenberg had invented the press, turned into broadsides. The earliest true crime book that we know of was printed around Shakespeare's time.
Oh
Uh,
wow.
yeah, it was a book. In fact, it's in the. I was asked to be the true crime consultant for this year's Guinness Book of World Records. They do a true crime section, and one of the entries, that I include is the oldest true crime book in English, and that's I forget the exact title. There's one called God's Revenge Against the Crime of Murder. Consisted of different case histories of gruesome murders that had taken place over the years. So, yeah, I mean, it's just a perennial fascination with gruesome crime. Um, Again, you look at the 17th century, the 18th century. In fact, in the United States, the very first book that was ever printed here by the New England Puritans was a true crime book.
Yeah.
Because every time a gruesome murder happened, they would print these what they call gallows sermons, which consisted of uh, descriptions of the crime, and then at the end, the perpetrator's uh, confession and his statement of repentance before he hanged. So again, a lot of true crime books were printed under the pretext of offering some moral or spiritual edification.
Yeah.
Uh,
And that actually gets me to an interesting point maybe there, Harold. So like because obviously w- like society evolved to like kind of really try and maybe dilute that kind of violent instinct within people. Religion is especially as well. It's like
mm,
so much of it is trying to dilute
mhm,
that violent instinct that is inside of us because we evolved from like hyper probably violent creatures. And
mm,
but I think maybe does true crime then give like this sort of cathartic release,
mhm.
or am I going maybe too philosophical with that? To
Yeah,
think
no,
like because we know, I mean, we were talking off camera about Carl Ung, and like
yeah,
Carl Ung has like had such a profound impulse or influence on my life, because just of the way he was able to almost, you know, talk about the shadow that lives inside every person, but like it's almost not something that you should be ashamed of.
mhm,
It's obviously something you should wrestle with, which
yeah.
is perfectly fine. But does true crime maybe then give that cathartic release to that animal, that violent animal maybe that lives inside of us?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. I think catharsis might be putting it a little too strongly, but the fact is, we are innately violent creatures. Um, there's a book that influenced my thinking called Demonic Males by a
Hmm?
Harvard primatologist named Richard Wrangham. and he lived among chimpanzees, for a long time. We,
Oof.
as you may or may not know, we share more DNA with chimpanzees than chimpanzees do with gorillas. Um, and chimpanzees are insanely violent creatures who commit all kinds of atrocities. If a chimpanzee from another tribe wanders onto the territory of some other chimpanzees, they'll just, disembowel him and cannibalize him and so on and so forth. So yeah, we are, as you were saying, there's this primordial violence, that is a part of our nature. Um, the one very positive thing you could say about our species is that we have found ways of kind of sublimating that violence.
Mm.
So, we need all these outlets for what the philosopher William James calls the carnivore within.
Yeah.
You're calling it shadow.
Brilliant book.
Yeah. And part of the civilizing process that has gone in, that has occurred over the millennia, has to do with finding sort of socially acceptable ways for human beings to ventilate those violent impulses so that, one of my arguments, people are always complaining, for example, about, well, every time a new form of popular culture has come along, people have complained about how violent it is, how, the harmful influence it's having, whether it was comic books or
Yeah.
movies or now violent video games. But the fact of the matter is, we need those outlets. We need those outlets for those violent impulses. And what we have done, is created socially acceptable ways in which we can ventilate those violent impulses without hurting people. Not that long ago, I mean, the blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, in our own country, in my country, for example, a little over a century ago, well, even into the 20th century, people would gather to see people hanged.
Yeah.
That was a form of entertainment.
Yeah.
During the French Revolution, parents would take their kids to the Place de la Concorde, to see these people get their heads chopped off.
Yeah.
And then they might buy their kid a little toy guillotine so the kid could go home and behead birds and mice. That was just.
And
And
Harold, I'm not sure if you've read that book, The Faithful Executioner.
uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's about that German executioner. I think it's like 17th century,
Yeah.
where, like, again, he's a man of faith, but he
Yeah.
grew up in a family that his dad
Yeah.
was an executioner, and he had to almost carry on I don't want to say the trade, but
Mm-hmm.
it kind of was explained like a trade, but
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, where he's like chopping off heads
Yeah.
in front of a German crowd that is almost frenzied by
Yeah.
like, people are going getting their hot dogs, like,
Oh, yeah.
or
Well, in the past, one of the perks of being a hangman was that you got to keep the rope, that the criminal was hanged with. And these guys would then, cut it up into 1-inch pieces and sell it as souvenirs, to the crowd that had gathered to watch this. So I guess what I'm saying is that true crime is one of many outlets where we get to vicariously experience our own cruel and sadistic and primordial violent fantasies. And then, when the criminal is punished at the end, we relieve ourselves of whatever subconscious guilt we might have felt in taking this pleasure. The fact of the matter is, when you ask people often, why they're interested in true crime, they'll say, oh, I'm interested in the psychology of the killer and blah, 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 blah. But the bottom line is, true crime is a form of entertainment.
yeah,
We
it's
find
like,
that, we find these horrible atrocities entertaining. And we
yeah,
find them entertaining the same way, that the audience of the Colosseum, found gladiator fights entertaining. That's
Yeah.
just part of human nature. The difference now is we don't demand to see actual murder. We're happy to watch it in a virtual way. And to me, that's a sign of, that we are growing more and more civilized. Violent video games to me are an example of how brutal we are. It's an example of, now we're happy, just to watch virtual violence as opposed to, it's like I was thinking the movie Braveheart.
Yeah.
When William Wallace was executed, before thousands of people, they were there to watch him be disemboweled and castrated and blah, blah, blah. Now we're happy to watch Mel Gibson,
Portray it.
being, photogenically, put to death without actually seeing all the stuff that really goes on. So, that's a big improvement.
Definitely. And look, come here. I know, Harold, neither me and you are evolutionary biologists by any extent of it. But like, why do you think, like, because this is like, and I suppose I'll bore out my reason as we go along, but why do you think chimps are that violent? Like, as a very close, probably cousin to, what Homo erectus are and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because we know, like, the leader, typically the leader in the chimp platoon is, tends to be more rational. It tends to be more almost Machiavellian. Like, when you go really deep into like chimp platoons, but within that culture, like, because it is a kind of microcosm of human culture in a kind of maybe more abstracted way. But why do you think like that extreme violence, which we see in parts of the world and which we'll probably elaborate on, but why do you think that violence is so cemented almost in chimp culture? Like, do you think there's a beneficial, like some sort of evolutionary beneficial or political beneficiary there within it?
Well, I mean, nature is nature red in tooth and claw. In general, the natural world is a violent place. So, I mean, I guess chimpanzees, being part of nature, participate in that. I mean, at this point, you're getting into, very profound and possibly metaphysical questions.
Yeah.
So there's a book that affected my thinking very much when I was a teenager, Robert Ardrey's African Genesis, which was one of the first to argue that, our evolutionary connection to, this primate violence, basically that we descend from killer apes. And I was thinking at the beginning of Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah.
That opening scene, where our primate, the earliest humanoid ape-like figures that we descended from, discover weapons and commit the first murder. And then, there's a famous moment where the ape throws the bone. He's refused to kill another ape in the air, and it cuts to a spaceship. And that kind of, to me, captures, this reality that we have, technologically we've advanced in the flash of an eye, but we're still those killer apes.
Yeah.
I mean, and
Harold, even to jump in there, like, because this has been like a thing, like, so Harold, right? Imagine tomorrow morning you wake up, right? Civilization has suddenly collapsed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so some event has happened, an EMP, grid lines down. Something has happened where civilization has collapsed. Now, your survival, based on like personality traits and all that, I would speculate that the more psychopathic people within the population have by far the greatest chance of survival in almost in where civilization is gone. Like, so your typical thing, like if you watch Walking Dead or anything like that. It's like the Negan type
Yeah.
within that show.
Yeah.
And that kind of poses this question is like, you know, and then coming at it from an evolutionary perspective, like, is there an element there where like psychopathy is, you know, an incredibly adaptive,
Mm.
well, again, in modern society, morally probably corrupt, but an incredibly adaptable personality trait for a kind of unstructured society. And it kind of goes back to that like killer ape within us as well. And it's always like this thought experiment I run as well. It's like I'm always trying to figure out like why something as fascinating and as destructive as psychopathy has literally, you know, maintained, like they reckon 1%, obviously higher in criminal populations. But I think like that's probably more of a symptom of modernity, where it's like it wasn't this all-out warfare that our you know, our whole lineage, our whole ancestry would have grown out of. And it poses this question of like the killer ape, the psychopath, like, you know, it's adapted for something, but it's not born out within our society. Now, that's a very controversial take. People can get very, you know, offended by that. But what's your thoughts on that? Like, am I
Well,
out of
I
my mind?
well, I don't want to jump to any like conclusions there, but well, there I think you're raising several different issues. You know, if society, I mean, there would be a reversion to savagery, obviously, if
Yeah.
civilization collapsed. You know, because again, you know, on some very, very fundamental level, we are, you know, we're animals. And again, you know, our ancestors were these killer apes. And in order to survive, you know, that primordial aspect of yourself, you know, would have to emerge, you know, where you'd become, you know, you either become, you know, under those conditions, you're either predator or prey, right?
Yeah.
Um, so, you know, and I think the people who, uh, you know, it's interesting. One of the books I taught during my many years of as a college professor teaching American literature was Moby Dick.
Yeah.
And,
Brilliant
you
book.
know, so Moby Dick, you know, this monomaniacal madman, Ahab, is leading the whole ship to its inevitable destruction. And the only one who really realizes it is his first mate, Starbuck, you know, which is, of course, where, you know, the coffee, you know, company got its name from.
Yeah.
Um, and the thing about Starbuck is he's a really good, decent man. And he realizes, and again, he's the only one who knows what, you know, that they're all doomed as long as Ahab is alive, really. And there's a scene where Ahab is sleeping in his hammock, and Starbuck comes in and he sees the rifle. He takes the rifle, and he thinks seriously about shooting Ahab, because he knows unless he shoots Ahab, they're all going to die. But he can't bring himself to do it. You know, he's undone
Yeah.
in a way by his civilized morality. You know, his civilized morality turns them all into victims.
Yeah,
You
and,
know,
and
if it's
that's
not,
the insight, I think, isn't it? Like it's
yeah.
like, and I think like there is these uncomfortable insights or almost truths that,
Hmm.
like, I think society sometimes will kind of skirt around.
Hmm.
And I think it's probably beneficial to skirt around it, because I think there, there's almost an aspect where we don't need to be reminded of like that,
Hmm.
as Ung would call it, that shadow in us. We need to face it and we need to conquer it ourselves. But I think like you're facing it like that, or kind of giving it any sort of voice within, is
Hmm.
probably dangerous. And I think that's what happens with a lot of serial killers. Now I know like the fantasy maybe, you know, can overpower and all, but they give maybe too much credence to that, like that dark voice, that kind of, you know, slithering tongue within, and it becomes a dangerous thing, because you give that, you know, airtime within your own head, like, and it's, that can become the dominant voice.
Mm-hmm.
We all have like a certain level of control over our thoughts. We know, like, from so much psychology, there's, aberrant thoughts, there's like wayward thoughts and all that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think, within the brain, there's lots of messages competing for the same attention.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with a lot of like these people that go down the very dark paths, which you have covered so extensively in your career, have almost tuned into that like wrong voice, that kind of primordial ancient voice that is
Yeah.
very closely linked, as you said, to that kind of killer
Yeah.
chimp, that killer ape.
Well, it's very hard. Ted Bundy described, he spoke about what he called the entity,
Yes, he
the
did. Yes.
possession. And, there's some way in which, um, there's, with the notorious serial killers, we think of Bundy and Gacy and so on. Yeah, I mean, there's this monster that lives within them that, just coexists, with their rational selves. Um, and that just takes possession of them, on a regular basis, and
Yeah.
uh, and compels them to commit these atrocities. So again, Melville, in his book Billy Budd, talks about the villain Clagger. He says, he said these men are madmen of the most dangerous sort because they're very rational,
Yeah.
usually of above average intelligence, but they employ their rationality for the most malevolent ends. That malevolence is just like this thing inside them, that takes possession of them. I mean, for all that I've studied serial murder and so on and so forth, I've given up trying to understand
Yeah.
the sources of that kind of criminal psychopathology, how it operates. I mean, what I've
It's so
spent,
varied, Harold. Like,
well,
I think,
it's
you know,
just we,
it's,
yeah, I'm sorry.
oh no, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to put in.
No, I say to people, you can't understand a Jeffrey Dahmer any more than you can understand a Mozart.
Yeah,
There are just
that's
some,
100%.
the Bible talks about the mysteries of iniquity, where evil comes from, how it operates. I mean, those are just, at this point, beyond our comprehension. So, I mean, we're always looking in a way for reassuring, easy answers. Oh, he was abused as a child, or he suffered a head injury when he was 5 years old. But ultimately, it's a mystery.
Yeah, and that's like, I think our brains are so hardwired to find patterns,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because we need to be able to explain things. Like, unclosed loops are yeah, really great against our kind of rational brain, that frontal cortex. We need to be able to close the loop, understand it. But I think the variance then across like killers is so wide. Like, it's exactly what you said. Like a Ted Bundy, because it all, like, the fantasies differ, the methodology differs,
Mm-hmm.
the motives differ. And I think that's what makes it exciting, but sometimes it's what really frustrates it as well for any
Mm-hmm.
like true crime fan, because I always fall into the trap of,
Mm-hmm.
asking the guests you know, like a singular question, trying to quantify like a very multivariate response, because there
Mm-hmm.
is like, why does someone kill? Well, like it's such a low resolution question that I've actually trained myself not to ask anymore, because
Mm-hmm.
it's just a low resolution question, because everything is so dependent on variation, and that why someone does that, like, you know why someone does one thing is completely different than someone else's motivation, even though they might converge onto the exact same outcome. And I think that's the probably lesson is what I've seen is there's just so much multivariance, but
Yeah.
I think but then there's almost an element in me as well that wants to wants to speculate
Yeah.
on,
Well, I mean, they
oh,
do have
it's
certain
because of
things.
this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all those psychos, Bundy and Gacy and Dahmer and so on and so forth. I mean, they do have one thing in common. I mean, they're all sexual psychopaths.
Yeah, that's it.
They're all extreme sexual sadists. Um, it's sexual, what used to be called in the old days lust murder. It's a phenomenon. There's nothing new about that phenomenon. There seemed to be, again, this particular period in the United States where that produced a number of these extreme sexual homicidal sex monsters. But they do share that they're all um, extreme sexual sadists who derive their sick pleasure from torturing and murdering helpless victims.
Yeah.
But again, exactly what the source of that particular psychopathology is very hard to say.
Yeah. And like Harold, touching on that, right? So we know from the stats I got now, correct me if I'm wrong, 1970s, I think the FBI had a clocked at around 250 active serial killers within the US. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the most up to date stats I can get is around FBI clocks at around 50 or less
Mm-hmm.
active serial killers. I don't want to say like is that trend dying out. Like I think forensic, I think the environment has evolved at such a pace that like
Mm-hmm.
successfully operating a serial killer isn't conducive to you know to being able to stay active. You're going to get caught.
Yeah.
Uh, so we know any like I don't think any of these drives like you go back into history, man.
Mm-hmm.
You see like sexual sadism. You have a Tossa, which
Mm-hmm.
is Xerxes' mother, like incredibly psychopathic and evil woman. You have which. Again, some people will argue with me on this and stuff like that, but Genghis Khan, like this, like there's a bloodlust there that goes on beyond
Mm-hmm.
conquering a land and stuff like that. We've seen it throughout history. And what I think now is society surveillance, like law enforcement's forensics, everything is squeezing into this point where these these dark fantasies are becoming less feasible to be acted upon. So
Mm-hmm.
what then spouts out of that? Like I know we're living in a virtual world. We have lots of, you can go into like probably weird pornographic routes or whatever everyone wants to go to. But then what spawns out of like this unenactment? Like if you any theories on this, you've followed this your whole career. Like what's the next what's the reformation maybe of that serial killer within modernity?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, there were certain cultural conditions that produced, that surge of serial sex murderers.
Like which?
Well, I mean, I think the whole in the United States, and I guess in the West in general, there was this complete, dropping of inhibitions. It's like the collective id was suddenly released.
Oh, Freud.
As a result of the social and sexual revolution of the late '60s, early '70s. The philosophy back then was, hey, if it feels good, do it. But that didn't take into account that for some people, what feels good, is abducting a helpless person and torturing them, and then murdering.
So was
So
that like sorry to put in, but like because I grew up in like I was born in '87, so grew up in the
yeah,
'90s. But back then, like, was it like it was that profound, like kind of nearly act on your impulse, or like kind of if it
yeah,
feels good,
totally,
do it. Like was it
yeah,
like
yeah,
that was the kind of free loving time?
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Oh.
But you know, the swinging '70s. Just if you the whole, well, there were serious psychologists and philosophers who felt, that all the problems, let's say in American society, caused by too much repression of the sexual impulses, too much whatever, so this whole like, you got to free yourself of repression. You got to let it all hang out. You got to blah, blah. But again, it didn't take into account, you know, what that meant, for a certain small, wait, I'm moving around here for a
Yeah,
second
no worries.
because I got to feed my dog. But, with that, that there was a small population of people, for whom that meant, committing these atrocities. And also, there were many more vulnerable victims
Yeah.
back
People
then.
were so trusting back then, I think, as
Well, it's
well.
not that they were trusting, it's just that they were, that they were available. There were more what they call victims of opportunity.
Yeah.
Hitchhiking hippie girls, and I mean, young women in
When did that
cities.
change then, Harold? Like, when
When
did
did
it? Yeah, when was the like almost when I'm going to hitchhike here, free love, free
yeah,
spirit, and then it became, oh shit! I actually, this isn't a good idea. Like, was there a definitive line or even a period where it switched over?
yeah. Well, I mean, I think you know, some of these very notorious, highly publicized cases discouraged certain people, made them more wary. And again, the mores of the society gradually changed and evolved. So,
Yeah,
um, but to me, it, the different eras produce different kinds of signature crimes, and that reflect the conditions of the era.
yeah,
And so again, to me, there's a direct connection between the this kind of, say, epidemic is way too strong, but this rash, of horrible sex killings
yeah.
and the sudden, the sexual revolution of that period. So,
Yeah, and look, come here. In the exact same vein that you said that, I think it'd be remiss not to ask this question. And no problem if you don't want to answer, because I know, like, I don't want, like, this podcast is not politicized. It's never, there's never a view of any position. But I think the events there that, like, I think rocked the world this week, that assassination,
mhm,
and like, I think we're seeing, like, I think increasingly more so, especially with Luigi Meggiani killing
mhm, mhm,
that CEO of United Health, this kind of fanatical killing, and then we've seen it with Charlie Kirk, that, like, mad killing, like, it's just like,
mhm,
and I think what absolutely dumbfounded me more so was this. It was almost like this cyber psychopathy invaded the space. Like, there was
mhm,
outpourings of support for the Charlie guy, but the amount of people then that had almost lost all sense of empathy and
yeah,
morality. It was like,
hello.
it was so, like,
Yeah. Hold on a second.
incredibly, like, well, alarming to see, but fascinating to see as well. Like, this almost cyber psychopathy, which I don't like. I do not believe these people would be bad, like, to the bone. Uh, but then they find whatever it is, this, like, kind of maybe tribalism, but they've turned into psychopaths in this, like, one clip, 30-second clip. Like, what do you
Mhm,
think's, like, is this a new type of killer we're going to get, like this
mhm.
fanatical killer, or has it always been around?
Well, as you probably know, I think I was reading something about this the other day. Um,
Yeah,
Sort of the obsession with serial killers has faded.
yeah, it is.
The new crime, that's become the collective obsession. Mass murderers, shooters. That's, as I said, I mean, that's the signature crime of our own era. Again, what exactly, the sources of that are is hard to say. I mean, one obvious thing is that I mean, and there's no solution to this. There are just too many guns in this country. I mean, I'm not totally anti-gun by any means, but things have really gotten out of hand, and people always are saying, well, it's not a problem with guns, it's a problem of mental health, and it's like, yeah, but if you make guns available to people, with mental health problems, then you're going to get stuff like this. So, yeah, I just don't. It's just hard to know what's happening now.
Yeah, it's just like I think yeah,
I mean, the turning point there was obviously the Columbine killings.
yeah,
I think the Columbine killings, that was the point at which the mass shooter began to replace a serial killer as the criminal monster of our times.
yeah. And do you think like so like okay, we've had maybe the serial killer era, Harold. We've had that, or we're probably maybe in the grips of the mass shooter. Like you've studied this so in depthly, probably more than anyone I could ask on the planet. Genuinely, like, is it what comes next? Do you think? Like, what is the next evolution? Like we've had maybe like warlords in ancient times. We've had Colosseum. We've had all these iterations of
Hmm.
violence, maybe taking like this spotlight on public appeal. Serial killers, very recent. Mass shootings, school shooters, whatever you want to call them. Getting a limelight there. Definitely in the last decade. What
Hmm.
comes next, or do we even want to contemplate on it? But I would love to hear your opinion.
Well, I mean, I have no firm opinion.
Yeah,
Um, the human the violent nature of our species makes it certain uh, the violence isn't going to go away. Um, it's hard to say. I mean, maybe people will figure out how to use AI to commit murder, you know, but yeah, but I have no,
well, Harold, right, speaking on that, so come here, me and you know like too well. We've been into the literature on, the
mhm,
genesis of serial killers, psychopathy, and all that. We know there's a developmental period of 5 years that is so critical,
mm,
for the developmental
yeah,
trajectory of any child.
yeah,
Whether it's going to be a good outcome, a bad outcome, or a fucking catastrophic outcome. We know them
yeah,
first 5 years. AI is what, 4 years old, like
hmm,
the agenic AI that we're dealing
yeah,
with is
yeah,
around four
yeah,
years old. If that is like, you know, slurping up the dialogue and the cultural mores of modern day internet, like, are we in fear then? Like, and play with me. Are we in fear of creating like almost a psychopathic AI like that? Is if they're gonna like grow up on the almost the grotesque headlines that are like permeating
yeah,
society, like, are we in fear of birthing a like psychopathic AI that is going to
yeah.
be probably more terrifying than a million Ted Bundys?
Oh, yeah. Well, you get the Terminator,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
but yeah, I mean, well, I think people are concerned about stuff like that.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I mean, uh, look, I mean, serial murder hasn't gone away.
yeah.
You're talking to me
It's
from Long
reduced.
Island. We have this Gilgo Beach murderer and so on.
Yeah,
It's just that the fascination with the serial killer, you know, has sort of faded, or the obsession with the serial killer has faded. I mean, serial killers are still ubiquitous in movies and TV shows and so on. But in general, again, it's not the monster that haunts the dreams of the culture at large anymore. So it's not even so much what new form of murder will arise as what particular form of murder will again become the dominant nightmare of the culture at large. Do you know what
I
I'm
never
saying?
thought about it like that, but that's like a really interesting. That's actually a really interesting way of putting it because I genuinely never thought about it like that. It's almost what's the, what like enters the cultural social zeitgeist as the kind of boogeyman
Yeah, exactly.
murderer maybe.
Yeah. Well, back in the 1890s, which is a period I've written a lot about, people, there were serial murders back then. I'm writing about one now. There were mass murderers back then. Um, but people were very obsessed with poison murders. There were a few notorious cases of poison murder, but the poison murderer back then became, the great boogeyman of the culture. Not so much even because, you know, there hadn't been poison murders before. It's just that at that time, the American public, was very, very, had been made very aware of how much poison there was, just in their medicine and in their food and so on and so forth. And the poisoner became the incarnation of of those fears. In the same way the serial murder, I mean, there were these horrible serial murders, but they also became, the incarnation of, the shadow side of the sexual revolution,
Yeah.
you know. So, yeah, a lot of it has to do with that. Um, anyway, who knows? I mean, something obviously there will be some there will be some new monster, to come along that
Yeah.
incarnates, the collective nightmares. But I'm,
Who
I don't know.
knows what it's going to be? And that's why,
Yeah,
I'm going to transition here away from the speculative, the
yeah,
speculative portion of this episode, and actually get back into the historical. So, like, I kind of wanted to really start back with your story, like where, you were a young guy growing up in, in America somewhere. What drew you into true crime? Like, I know you professor of literature, professor emeritus, which is even more impressive of English and all that. But where did I suppose the segue into true crime like originate from in your story?
yeah. Well, what I always tell people is that first of all, I grew up. Uh, I was born in 1948. I grew up at a time when, uh, pop culture was permeated with monsters. Just
Wow.
watching horror movies and monster movies. So horror was always a big part of my imagination. And then, I became interested in why we need stories about monsters. Where that comes from. We need stories about monsters from a very early age, from the time we're kids. And, at some point I became aware of, that there were these actual criminals who seemed to be the flesh and blood incarnations of these fairy tale monsters.
Yeah.
The first one was Ed Gein.
Oh, and we get to
And I
him.
became aware, that Gein had been the inspiration of a Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I wrote that book. And at the time I wrote that book, I thought I was inventing a new genre. I didn't think of it as true crime. I thought of it as true horror, because I
Yeah.
was writing about these figures, as I said, who seemed like these supernatural monsters come to life.
Yeah.
And that's how they were described in the press. Um, so yeah, so I wrote the Gein book that did well. My editor uh, advised me that if I wanted to succeed as a writer, I needed to pigeonhole myself. And for better or worse, writing about psychopathic sex murder seemed congenial to my temperament. So one thing
But
led to another. And
I
yeah, I
suppose
mean,
that sells though. Like because
yeah, well,
it's like
I mean, at the
we've
time
talked
that I,
about it so much,
yeah,
that sells.
yeah. Well, at the time I started, true crime, and especially historical true crime, is not, I mean, it was sort of considered fringe literature. Um, Certainly in my academic life, none of my colleagues, took it seriously or anything. Um, it's only in recent years that true crime has become such a big thing.
Yeah.
Um, but I was, again, I was fascinated by these characters who, you know, were viewed by their contemporaries, as these supernatural monsters come to life. Albert Fish, the werewolf of Wisteria.
Oh, yeah.
You
He
know, yeah,
was like, he just, it's the particular, like, the way he was going around. Like, I think what really gets me about him was that he was going in like, a farmer, landowner, bringing people, like, yeah, just a level of manipulation and,
mm.
yeah, just evil. Like,
Oh yeah,
oh,
yeah.
and he was like, that was what, was that the 20s? Albert Fish, he
Well,
was
he
like,
was. Yeah, I mean, he was. I mean, he didn't get caught till the 30s, but he had been committing his atrocities, for decades. So.
and Harold, come here, like in all the ones you followed or
Hmm.
wrote about or studied, like who is there anyone that has like really raised the hair in the back of your neck that you're just like,
Yeah. Well,
ooh, or
Fish.
the one that you would be least want to be in a room with, maybe?
I don't know if I want to be there with anyone, but well, yeah. I mean, the Fish case was the most disturbing for me to
Right, go
write
on,
about.
let's get into it. Like in what aspect, just for all the listeners, like most should be familiar with Albert Fish, but even to give a quick blurb, maybe.
Well, I mean, Fish. The thing about Fish was, uh, is that he first of all he preyed mostly on children.
Yeah,
I mean, he preyed entire. He was this. You
sicko.
know, I mean, when he was finally captured, the psychiatrists who examined him, they were at a loss for language, to describe, the kinds of atrocities and perversions he engaged in. But he was somebody, and I'll just mention this as one typical example, who got pleasure. He would abduct a young boy, castrate him, and then just leave him to bleed to death.
Oh,
And and he would, this would be a source of great sexual pleasure for him. He also was a masochist of a kind, that no psychiatrist had ever encountered before. He was, when they finally arrested him, his jailers noticed he was very uncomfortable when he sat upright on his prison cot. And he explained to them it was because he had all these needles shoved up inside him, and they didn't believe him. And they took him to the prison infirmary and x-rayed him, and there were 27 needles of varying sizes floating around his bladder region, because one of the things that gave him pleasure was inserting needles up into his perineum and just leaving them there. So, I mean, that's an example of his masochism, but in terms of his sadism, he would subject his juvenile victims, to the most agonizing tortures, uh, which would provide him with his highest sexual pleasure. So, he was just, in many ways, the most unspeakable,
yeah,
of all the monsters our culture has produced, although, they've produced some other pretty terrible ones. So.
yeah.
But writing that book, which was the second book I did, is the one that was most disturbing to me.
Oh, I can imagine that because like them acts, like anything I find with juvenile or child is
Hmm.
especially heinous. And that's not to say like that murdering an adult or torturing an adult is any different, but I think there's something so reprehensible.
Hmm.
Among getting the pleasure out of the torture of a child, like it's
Hmm.
just it's very hard for like any rational brain or any like moralistic person to be able to comprehend that that
Hmm.
sort of evil like walks among you, and that
Hmm.
that sort of evil could be your neighbor, or that that sort of evil is you know, out there within, like, because it is out there within society, like it was in the 20s and 30s with fish and stuff like that. But like, how, like, from your brain, like, because I know, like, you can come at this from every angle. Like, you can try look understand it from a religious perspective that it's
Mhm.
all there's demonic forces there at play. It's the devil. You can come at it from a psychological perspective, and you can be like, you know, a upbringing, mother, you know, a myriad of different environmental factors. You can come at them from a neuroscientific perspective, and you can be like, okay, you know, different brain regions, maybe the amygdala is shut down, etc., etc. What like purview are you coming at to try and understand this sort of, you know, depraved, deviant, like, you know,
Mhm.
person, like human being?
Yeah.
Because it's a human being. How are you trying to understand it? In which prism?
Well, I mean, I grew up totally steeped in the depth psychology of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Freud. I did my PhD dissertation used Jungian psychology.
Oh,
Um, so,
brilliant.
so yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, psychological. But again, I mean, that in a way that takes you only so far. There are certain mysteries of, even Freud ultimately threw up his hands in trying to analyze where artistic creation came from and so on and so forth. Again, you can point to in the lives, in the backgrounds of many serial killers, point to extreme forms of childhood abuse and humiliation and, the factors which undoubtedly went into the making of these creatures. But then you say, well, there are other people who are subjected to those kinds of
Yeah.
conditions who didn't grow up to be elderfish. So yeah, I mean, it's just again, yeah, my orientation is 20th century depth psychology.
Yeah.
You know, but again, I've discovered that can only take you so far.
Yeah, and like what I think one of my favorite instances of 20th century depth psychology is Carl Jung reading Ulysses by James Joyce and
Mm.
being like, that's the work of a psychotic.
Oh,
And I
yeah,
just think it's so funny because if you do read Ulysses, you might need two or three times to read it because it's so like
yeah,
there's almost a barrier up to like an articulation of English, but if you can make it through like one or two times, you can understand where Jung is coming from. It's like
yeah.
it does seem like the wrangling of or the almost the stream of consciousness of a
Mm.
madman.
Well, definitely stream of consciousness for sure.
Yeah,
But I mean, anytime you record stream of consciousness, you are dealing with the dark and the irrational, right?
yeah,
I mean, the unconscious does not operate, in terms of, well, state the obvious, rational,
yeah,
logical way. So,
yeah.
I mean,
And that's the
part of it,
thing.
yeah.
Like, I think that's the fascinating thing about people, like, because people can seem very rational on the exterior. The
Mm.
interior is like hiding this, like almost bounty of different, you know, like this soup of psychological maybe maladaptions that
Yeah.
you know,
Well,
people don't want to admit, and like this is what I love about Ung. Like Ung was very, like I felt anyway from because my background's in psychology. I didn't know you had a, but I should have anyway because your books are very like it comes from almost a psychological perspective.
mhm.
But I think with Young, I think with Rogers, there's a few of them there that kind of delve into like you know definitely that kind of more humanistic. Like I think the biggest travesty of maybe the last 40 years has been the absolute complete obliteration of Freud.
I
Like
agree with you.
I,
Yeah.
I absolutely detest that. Like I think Freud is still like come here. Do you know how much I'm going to show you? Like
Oh, yeah.
this is how
Oh,
much I
good.
love Freud. I have his
Yeah.
bust
Yeah.
here on my desk. Like I think it was one of the probably biggest contributions.
Yeah.
I think to philosophy, I think to the understanding of humanity, not just the mind.
Yeah.
And for him to be like when I came up through my undergraduate, the test and like the kind of almost sneery
Hmm.
the kind of sneery vibes like you bring up Freud, where I really connected with him, and I don't know
Yeah.
whether it was from what it was from, but like I just think the way people like just shoo him away is just
No, I
reprehensible.
couldn't agree with you more. Couldn't agree with you more. It's one of the, things that disturbs me most. And I do feel that the complete, what you're saying, obliteration, the rejection of Freudian insight, has led to many of the problems in our contemporary society.
Yeah. Oh my
I
God,
really,
we're
I
in
really
agreement.
do feel that. I feel that strongly. So yeah, I'm
Yeah.
glad to hear you say that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's like, I also think as well, his ability to be able to like, like I remember with Moses and his book Moses and Monotheism, like
Hmm.
absolutely incredible insight off that book. But not only that, it was like his ability to be able to go back and like tether stuff back to to ancient stuff,
Hmm.
to be able to like even with narcissism,
Hmm.
and relay it back to myth,
Hmm.
the kind of Oedipus complex, bringing
Hmm.
it back to the story of Oedipus. Because I think within ancient wisdom, like there is so much more profound insight than,
Hmm.
modern contemporary society will allow you to extract from
Hmm.
stories. I think
Hmm.
the wisdom back there is so, yeah, it's on such a higher level because I think people were like, very few people could write.
Hmm.
I think everything. So the people that could, I think, were at probably the highest echelon of
Hmm.
society, and what
Hmm.
they wrote down. Like you can imagine, a word was maybe a pound of gold because like
Hmm.
these people were so rare, and it was insight was so it wasn't distributed in the population at all. So like what
Hmm.
went down on a page, what went down on a tablet, what went down on papyrus was literally probably the apex
Hmm.
of understanding in that era. And I
Hmm.
think Freud was able to go back there and look at all these ancient like
Hmm.
theories and be able to distill this in a modern way and get the wisdom from it. And I
Hmm.
think he was able to adapt that then into a almost a psychological framework,
Hmm.
and then just to
Well,
be
yeah,
dismissed, man,
yeah,
so like obnoxiously as he was, is a bruise on society.
yeah, yeah. Well, and as you know, I mean, Freud didn't claim that he had discovered the workings
No,
of the unconscious, but that he had found, a modern way in
take
which
on it.
to convey, that wisdom. So yeah, you're absolutely right about that.
Definitely. And so intent then, I suppose to get back as well, because I know we're going to talk about Ed Gein. And I love this, by the way. I love the kind of tangents and the kind of different little, side tracks we go on. But Harold, to bring us back then to like, because I know Netflix probably, I think they have a big movie coming out on
Hmm.
Ed Gein.
Yeah,
But like, as
very,
we
yeah.
know, man, like your book on Ed Gein, like profound.
Hmm.
And I think his like legacy in terms of like cult, like the amount of villains he's aspired, or horror villains anyway, has been, kind
Hmm.
of untold. But like, what drew you to that story originally?
Well, I'd actually been working on a book about movies, and I came across the fact, that Psycho and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and
Yeah.
Silence of the Lambs hadn't come out at that point, which were my two favorite horror movies, had both, been based on this real life case. So I began looking into that and thought, wow, this would make a great book. So yeah, that led to my, to Deviant. Yeah, there's this new series on Netflix coming out October 3rd. I'm having a little problem with it. I
Oh
mean,
shit! Tell us
yeah.
why.
Anyway, but without getting into all that,
We're not
uh,
getting into
yeah.
that.
But yeah, I mean, the thing about Gein, as I wrote in my book, and as I said elsewhere, it, it, well, through having, as I was saying, I grew up in the 1950s. All the monster movies that I saw, all
Yeah,
the monsters back then were like from somewhere else. I'm talking about somewhere else than the United States.
yeah,
Um, there were mummies from Egypt and vampires from Transylvania, and
Okay.
creatures from the Black Lagoon from the Amazon. There were invaders from Mars. Gein really, through Norman Bates, Americanized these monsters. He was the first real all-American monster, Norman Bates.
Jeez, yeah.
So,
Never thought about it like that, but yeah.
it changed, and of course, all the splatter movies of the '70s and so on, all came out of Psycho. So, yeah, I mean, Gein had this enormous cultural influence. Um, I think I use the phrase "the Godfather of gore" or something.
Yeah.
In my book.
Yeah. It's in the book.
So yeah, but
Yeah, the
yeah. So,
Godfather of Gore. And like again, we know like the archetype is very interesting with him because it's like, domineering mother, like hyper religious, religious. Uh Almost like that. Like I think the most fascinating thing about it was in the movie Psycho, where it's like, any sort of woman that like gives any sort of sexual
mhm. Stimulation.
response, then
Yeah.
it's like that becomes the object of attack, and
Okay.
it's so weird with Geen. But like, do you think that like was true for Geen, or was it more kind of a product of, we're going to put that into the Psycho movie, like because we know what Geen like. We know what Mary Hogan anyway. She was a bit more boisterous, like, and not the victim blame or anything like that. I'm not into that, but she was a bit more loudmouthed, kind of like the Jezebel or the kind of, you
Yeah.
know, the sort of woman his mother would have been talking about. But do you think like that he would have, like, do you think that's kind of true that he would have any woman that aroused maybe some sort of sexual appetite in him became like
Mhm.
this enemy?
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. But thing to remember about Gein, I don't consider Gein a serial killer.
Yeah,
He did kill,
too.
Mary Hogan, Bernice Worden.
Yeah,
Um, but he was not. When people read Deviant or this graphic novel I did with Eric Powell on the case,
yeah, yeah,
um, that it's possible to feel some sympathy for him, which you don't obviously with any of the other, with Bundy or any of those people. On the contrary, um, Gein was not, to me, the term sexual serial killer was coined specifically to describe what had previously been called lust murderers. That is, as we were saying, extreme sexual sadists, who
yeah,
derive their perverted pleasure from inflicting torture and murder on helpless victims. That was not Gein's MO. Gein was essentially a necrophile. His thing was digging up corpses, bringing them back, dissecting them, making various household objects out of their body parts. With Gein and with Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, he executed them very swiftly. He
yeah,
was not interested in abducting and torturing them.
yeah.
He
I
just
watched the
needed
thrill.
raw material, for his
Yeah,
household projects. So I don't see Gein as sharing the same psychology as these other serial killers. I mean, now he's called serial killers, and it's true that his crimes inspired these movies about serial killers. But he himself was, in my mind, not a serial killer. So.
no, in my mind, he wasn't like, because I know the movie Psycho has like strong associations with like psychopathy, but I don't think like even when like the prison guards talk about Geen as like, he felt very like in his later years he seemed to
Mm-hmm.
be very reflective and withdrawn, uh,
Mm-hmm.
which almost gives me the connotations of guilt, or that he felt some sort of guilt. But I don't think he was like a psychopath. I think he was, and I don't know if he was a psychotic either. I think he was probably just a bit of a weirdo, uh,
Yeah.
because like a psychopath, I don't think would. I just don't like. I think Geen just seemed so too soft to be a psychopath or something. I don't know what it is. I just don't get the feel that he was like the
Yeah.
classic like Bundy manipulative psychopath. I don't know. Maybe he was a psychotic. I know, like the judge did rule initially that
Yeah.
he was insane, not fit to rule trial. I don't know how new that. Like, I don't know how real that is. I think maybe back then, in that era, it was so
Hmm.
aberrant. Where
Hmm.
now, I think if he came on trial now, I think he'd be sent to jail straight away. I think he'd probably get the death penalty. I don't think. Yeah, I don't think they'd be like, oh, he's reason of insanity, because I think it's
Yeah.
probably been so diluted. But what's your thoughts on that? Like, do you think, was he a psychopath? Was he a psychotic? Or was he something maybe a bit more just a deviant?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think he did display certain symptoms that are consistent with psychosis.
Yeah.
He did have some hallucinations and so on and so forth. Um, there too, the psychology of the necrophile, has never really been fathomed, by the
Yeah.
psychiatric community. Um, so you could see all these different conditions that would have fed into, his mental state, the extreme isolation, the
Yeah.
influence of his mother. Um, but, what led him to try to, I mean, and so he was trying to really bring his mother back from the dead in a way. He was trying to re, resurrect her. Yeah, again, very mysterious.
Yeah.
Freud used the term overdetermined, to describe, that you can't reduce even a neurosis, to
Yeah.
one
100%.
simple cause.
Yeah.
So, something as extreme as Ed Gein, you certainly can't do that. By the way,
Yeah.
oh,
And last
yeah,
thing I will
yeah,
say on this is, yeah, I think like it probably goes back to trends. And like, I think what we see with a lot of trends is whether it's, Ed Gein, whether it's Dahmer, whether it's Dennis Nielsen in the UK, like this pervading loneliness seems to take
mm,
over in
yeah.
an absurd fashion. But Harold, look, I know you have to go. I am incredibly, privileged to have you on. Thank you so much. I'll put a link with all, with your Amazon author profile on the description below. All listeners, go check it out. There's so many books there. This is the godfather of true crime. Check out his books. Harold, thank you so much.
Thank you. No, it's a real pleasure. And yeah, it's very nice to become acquainted with somebody who feels about Freud the way I do. So very much admire that.
Well, cheers to that, Harold. Look,
Yeah,
thank you so much. I really
yeah.
appreciate it.
Thank you. Great meeting you.